Ethan arrived at his grandfather's ranch on a warm autumn afternoon, the place where he had spent countless childhood summers helping with cattle, fixing fences, and riding horses through golden fields. But this visit felt different. The house looked emptier, the barn doors were sealed shut, and there was a somber stillness in the air. Grandpa Henry sat in his favorite rocking chair on the porch, a folded envelope in hand. With a faint smile, he waved Ethan over. As they talked, Grandpa Henry revealed that he had sold the ranch for $1.2 million. Ethan's eyes widened, stunned by the sudden news. The land had been in their family for generations. When Ethan asked what he planned to do with the money, Henry calmly said, "I've already transferred it, all of it, to your dad." Word spread quickly across the family. Ethan's father, Michael, was ecstatic. He'd always had expensive tastes and big dreams, but had never been much for hard work. With the sudden windfall, he began boasting about real estate ventures, luxury renovations, and early retirement plans. Ethan watched it all unfold with quiet skepticism. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later that evening, Grandpa Henry pulled Michael aside and handed him a small, leather-bound journal. Inside was a single note: "Just look after me when I can't look after myself." Michael nodded and gave a casual, "Of course, Dad," without even reading the rest. But Ethan, watching from a distance, noticed the blankness in his father's eyes. No warmth, no honor in the promise he had just made. It felt more like a formality than a commitment. That weekend, the family hosted a dinner to celebrate the sale. The table was full, steaks sizzling, wine flowing, laughter echoing. But Grandpa Henry sat quietly at the far end, his plate barely touched. Michael dominated the conversation, bragging about high-return stocks and foreign properties. Every now and then, someone glanced at Grandpa, but no one asked how he felt about selling the land he'd built with his own hands. Ethan couldn't bear the disconnect. He watched as the man who had once been the pillar of their family faded into the background, treated more like a guest than the reason they were even at the table. Something in Ethan shifted that night. He realized this wasn't just about money. It was the beginning of something much deeper. As weeks passed after the ranch sale, the energy in Michael's home shifted. The initial excitement faded, replaced by cold practicality. Grandpa Henry, once treated with respect, was now more of a burden than a blessing. His room upstairs was needed for a new home office, so Michael moved him into the basement, a damp, cramped space with no windows and a creaky old bed. Rachel, Ethan's mother, occasionally brought him meals but avoided lingering too long. She felt uneasy about it all, but every time she raised her voice, Michael dismissed her. "Dad doesn't mind," he'd say. "He's lucky we're keeping him at all." Ethan, meanwhile, was traveling for work, unaware of how bad things had gotten. Calls between Ethan and Grandpa became infrequent. When they did speak, Grandpa's voice was tired, but he never complained. "I'm fine," he always said, "just resting these old bones." Ethan had no idea that his grandfather was often left alone for hours, sometimes forgotten altogether when the family went out. The basement was quiet but lonely, and Henry began to shrink into himself. The man who once roamed wide-open fields now had barely enough space to stretch his legs. One night, during a fierce storm, Ethan received a call that made his stomach drop. It was Rachel, whispering through tears. "Ethan, your dad kicked him out." Confused and angry, Ethan demanded an explanation. Michael grabbed the phone and said coldly he wanted to leave. Said he missed the fresh air. Ethan didn't believe a word. He jumped into his truck and sped through the rain, tires skidding, windshield wipers pounding against the glass. He found Grandpa sitting at a bus stop bench, soaked through, shivering, a small duffel bag by his side. The storm raged around him, lightning flashing across the sky. Ethan pulled over and ran to him, wrapping his coat around the old man's shoulders. Grandpa didn't say much, just a soft, "I knew you'd come." Ethan helped him into the truck, turned the heat all the way up, and drove home in silence, jaw clenched. Back at Ethan's apartment, he set up the guest room with warm blankets, tea, and a heater. Grandpa looked around, almost embarrassed. "This is too much," he said, but Ethan smiled. It's not even close to what you deserve. That night, they sat at the kitchen table sharing soup and stories. Henry talking about the early days of the ranch, and Ethan listening, wide-eyed and heartbroken. In the following weeks, Grandpa began to come alive again. They played cards, watched old westerns, and even went for short walks. Henry told Ethan stories he'd never heard before, of hard winters, lost friends, and sacrifices made without thanks. For the first time in years, he laughed out loud. Ethan learned more in those evenings than he had in a lifetime. But the joy was short-lived. Grandpa's health began to decline. Small things at first. Missteps, lost thoughts, lingering coughs. Then came the hospital visits and the quiet stares out the window. One night, as Ethan was cleaning up after dinner, Grandpa said, "You showed me what real family means. Blood doesn't matter. Kindness does." That same night, Ethan noticed Grandpa scribbling into a small notebook, his hands trembling but determined. Every evening after that, he wrote something down before bed, carefully locking it in the drawer before turning off the light. Ethan never asked what was inside. He figured it was letters, memories, maybe prayers. But something in Grandpa's eyes told him it was important, something final. One chilly morning, just as the sun began to rise, Ethan walked into Grandpa's room with a tray of breakfast, only to find him slumped in the chair, pale and barely conscious. Panic surged through him. He called an ambulance immediately, his voice trembling as he spoke to the dispatcher. The paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed Grandpa to the hospital. Ethan rode along, gripping his grandfather's hand the whole way, praying under his breath. At the hospital, Ethan paced the cold, sterile hallway outside the emergency room. Hours later, the doctor emerged, explaining that Grandpa had suffered a minor stroke and that his condition was fragile but stable for now. Ethan exhaled in relief but remained tense. He called his parents. Rachel picked up, shocked but soft-spoken. Michael didn't answer at first, but finally showed up at the hospital 2 hours later, dressed in a golf outfit and scrolling through his phone. Instead of asking how Henry was doing, Michael leaned over to Ethan and asked, "So, did he ever make a will?" Ethan was too stunned to answer. The selfishness hit like a slap. Michael didn't go in to see his father. He just sat in the waiting area, making business calls and sipping vending machine coffee. That evening, in the quiet of the hospital room, Grandpa opened his eyes and smiled faintly at Ethan. His voice was weak, but his mind was clear. He waved Ethan closer and began sharing stories from his past. How he built the ranch with his own 2 hands, lived through droughts, disease, and debt. He told of how Michael, even as a boy, avoided chores, always dreaming big but never putting in the work. He wanted the rewards, Grandpa whispered, but never the journey. Ethan sat beside him for hours, listening, asking gentle questions, and holding his hand. Grandpa seemed to gain a little strength through their talks, his eyes brighter, his soul lighter. He spoke of regrets, not selling the ranch, but trusting the wrong person with his legacy. I thought giving him everything would teach him responsibility, but giving isn't the same as earning. A few days later, Grandpa was discharged. He insisted on going home with Ethan. The doctor warned of another stroke, but Henry refused to stay in the hospital. "If I'm going," he said, "I want to go where there's love." Back in Ethan's guest room, Henry seemed at peace. He slept more, spoke less, but always scribbled in his notebook at night. One morning, Ethan found him still and quiet, his hand resting gently on the open pages of that very notebook. His breathing had stopped. He had passed in his sleep, the morning sun warming the room through the window. Ethan sat with him for hours before calling anyone. He tidied the room, folded his grandfather's blanket, and finally picked up the notebook. It was locked shut with a tiny brass latch, no key in sight. He held it in his hands like a sacred artifact, unsure of what it contained, but certain it mattered. The funeral was small and quiet. Grandpa had few remaining friends, but Benji, the old ranch hand, came. Michael gave a forced speech, talking about Henry's hard work while barely holding back yawns. Rachel cried silently. Ethan stayed, mostly quiet, carrying the weight of 100 memories in his chest. A week passed in a fog. Then, one morning, Ethan received a call from a number he didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Mr. Calloway, Grandpa Henry's longtime lawyer. His voice was formal but low, almost confidential. "Your grandfather left specific instructions," he said. "I need you to attend the will reading. You won't be there. Bring no one else, except your father and Benji." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Something in the lawyer's voice told him this wasn't going to be a routine inheritance. The air inside Mr. Calloway's law office was thick with tension as the family gathered for the will reading. The windows were shuttered against the afternoon glare, casting the room in a serious, almost ceremonial mood. Michael strolled in first, wearing a tailored suit and smug confidence. He greeted Mr. Calloway like an old friend, then sat down and tapped his fingers impatiently. Rachel followed behind, clutching her purse tightly, her eyes darting around the room as if afraid of what might come. Ethan walked in quietly, nodding respectfully to the lawyer before taking a seat near the back. And then came Benji. Everyone turned to look at the old ranch hand as he entered the room, hat in hand, eyes lowered in humility. Michael raised an eyebrow, clearly confused and a little insulted. "Why is he here?" he whispered, but Mr. Calloway said nothing. The lawyer simply gestured for everyone to be seated and opened a thick, leather-bound folder. He began by reading the public portion of Grandpa Henry's will. His tone was even, professional, yet as the words flowed, Michael's face began to lose color. According to the will, Henry had already transferred his intended inheritance to Michael during his lifetime. The $1.2 million gift, Mr. Calloway read, was given in full faith and without condition. As such, my son's chapter in my estate is considered closed. Michael's mouth fell open. Rachel gasped. Ethan looked over at Benji, whose expression remained still. "This must be a mistake," Michael snapped. "That can't be it. He promised me." But before he could finish, Mr. Calloway raised a hand and retrieved a smaller, sealed envelope from the folder. On it, in Grandpa's handwriting, were the words, "To be read in presence of Ethan and Benji only." The room fell silent. Rachel looked down, avoiding eye contact. Michael stood up, furious. "What is this? You're kicking me out of my own father's will reading." Mr. Calloway didn't flinch. "This portion was explicitly directed by your father. Legally, you must leave the room for us to proceed." Michael stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Now it was just Ethan, Benji, and the lawyer. Mr. Calloway opened the letter carefully and unfolded the aged paper. The first line was simple. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and my real work begins." His voice cracked for the first time, but he continued reading aloud. In the letter, Grandpa Henry admitted he had always known what kind of man Michael had become. "I love my son," he wrote, "but love doesn't make you blind. It just makes you patient." He went on to describe how he had hoped the gift of the ranch money would awaken something good in Michael, but instead, it revealed his true character. "But my legacy was never the ranch," the letter continued. "It was the sweat, the sacrifice, the stubborn belief in doing what's right, even when no one's watching. And you, Ethan, are the only one who understood that." Henry went on to explain that he had kept one final piece of land untouched, a quiet, hidden valley beyond the ridge, known only to him and Benji. On it lay rich mineral deposits he'd discovered years ago but never exploited, believing it wasn't time. Now it is, he wrote. Ethan was to receive full ownership of this land, along with a $500,000 trust fund to develop it, protect it, or use it for good. Do with it what you believe is right. Not for profit, but for purpose, Grandpa wrote, because you have the heart for it. Then the lawyer turned to Benji. Henry's letter continued. Benji, you were more loyal to me than my own blood. You worked without asking for anything and treated me like a man, even when others treated me like a burden. You are to receive a lifetime housing stipend and monthly salary from the trust. Live there. Guard it. Keep the soul of the land alive. Ethan sat in stunned silence. Benji's weathered hands trembled as he wiped his eyes. Mr. Calloway folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it across the table to Ethan. Your grandfather entrusted this to you. The land, the trust, and the responsibility. Outside, Michael could be heard arguing on the phone in the hallway. Inside the room, however, there was only silence. A silence filled not with shock, but with meaning. A silence that said everything Grandpa Henry had left behind was now in the right hands. As the second envelope was sealed and the formalities came to a close, Michael burst back into Mr. Calloway's office, red-faced and seething. He slammed his hand on the lawyer's desk and demanded answers. "You're not getting away with this," he spat. "That land, that money, it should be mine. He was my father." Mr. Calloway remained calm, his expression unreadable. Mr. Henry's will was revised and notarized 3 separate times, with multiple witnesses. Everything is airtight and legally binding. If you'd like to challenge it, you may. But I would advise you to consider how that would look in court and in public. Michael's fury turned into desperation. "This is theft," he yelled, voice cracking. "I sacrificed for him. I gave him my home." But even he didn't believe his own words. He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him for the second time that day, this time knowing it wouldn't reopen for him again. Later that evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, Ethan sat quietly in his small apartment, the sealed envelope resting on the table like a stone. His phone buzzed. "Rachel." He hesitated, then picked it up. Her voice was shaky, heavy with guilt. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I should have said something. I should have done something when your father moved him to that basement. I knew it was wrong. I just didn't want to cause trouble. I thought maybe it would get better." Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't want to hate her. She wasn't the villain in this story, but she hadn't been a hero either. "Some silence," he said gently, "speaks louder than words." There was a long pause on the line, followed by quiet sobs. "I hope you can forgive me one day," she whispered. "I already did," Ethan said softly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I forget." A week passed in quiet reflection. Ethan drove out to the plot of land Grandpa had left him, 20 untouched acres just beyond the old ridge. Benji was already there, waiting beside a rusted gate Ethan had never noticed before. The land looked wild and forgotten, yet strangely alive. Trees grew tall and dense, and birdsong filled the air. There was a stillness to the place that felt sacred. Benji guided him down a dirt path, leading to an old wooden cabin nestled among pines. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but when they opened the door, everything was intact, clean, preserved, protected from time. Inside, Ethan found a box labeled in Grandpa's handwriting. "If he's anything like I hope he is." And there were blueprints, sketches, maps, and journal entries. The papers outlined an idea Grandpa had once dreamed of: a retreat, a healing place for people who had no peace. Veterans, widows, broken families, forgotten elders. There were names of donors he'd once contacted, stories of people he wanted to help, and at the bottom of the pile, a hand-painted wooden sign. For those who still believe in the old ways. Ethan ran his fingers over the letters and felt the weight of the dream he'd inherited. Not just land, not just money, but a mission. He sat on the cabin floor with Benji and whispered he didn't want me to build something profitable. He wanted something permanent, something with a soul. Benji nodded. He said you'd know what to do when the time came. In the following weeks, Ethan made a decision. He reached out to local veterans organizations, trauma recovery groups, and community leaders. He used part of the trust to begin restoring the cabin, clearing the land, and constructing small shelters. He hired local builders, paid fair wages, and named the project Henry's Rest. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't quick, but it was real. The first people to arrive were a single mother and her teenage son who had just left a shelter. Then came a retired Marine dealing with PTSD. Soon, others followed. The land began to breathe again. Campfires, laughter, footsteps in the woods. The silence Grandpa had once endured now echoed with healing voices. Ethan looked around one evening as children played under the trees. Families gathered for a shared meal, and Benji whittled on the porch. He thought about Grandpa, about the ranch, the sacrifice, and the final whisper, "Just look after me." Ethan had, and more than that, he had honored the spirit behind those words. Not by keeping what was given, but by giving back everything that truly mattered. 1 year later, the land Grandpa Henry left behind had been completely transformed. Where once there was only wild underbrush and an old, forgotten cabin, now stood a thriving haven called Henry's Rest. The cabin had been restored with care, its wooden walls reinforced, its porch expanded. A garden bloomed beside it, tended by veterans and families who now called this place a second home. Children laughed as they picked vegetables, while volunteers painted fences and built benches around a fire circle in the center of the property. The space had grown into something sacred, more than shelter, more than charity. It was healing made tangible. Word had spread, and support poured in from nearby towns. Therapists offered weekly sessions, artisans taught workshops, and Sunday dinners were cooked in big batches to feed everyone who came. Ethan oversaw it all, not as a boss, but as a steward. He moved through the crowd with quiet humility, just as his grandfather once had on the ranch. One chilly evening, as the sun was dipping behind the ridge, a car pulled up. Dust trailed behind it as it crunched across the gravel driveway. Ethan looked up to see Michael, his father, step out slowly. He looked thinner, worn down. His expensive clothes had faded, and his shoes were scuffed. There was no trace of the man who once bragged about stocks and luxury condos. His eyes, for the first time in years, looked unsure. "I heard what you built," he said. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I lost everything." Ethan didn't reply right away. He studied his father, the same man who once left Grandpa out in a storm with nothing but a bag. The temptation to say no rose in his throat, but he pushed it down. "You can sleep in the guest loft tonight," Ethan said softly, "and I'll get you a hot meal, but only for one night." Michael looked shocked, almost humbled. "Why even that much?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Because I won't throw you out like you did to him," he said. "But this place? This isn't yours anymore." Michael looked away and nodded. That night, he sat by the fire alone while others laughed and talked. No one bothered him. No one welcomed him either. Later that night, Ethan sat in the cabin with the small brass key in his hand. He had found it tucked inside the lining of Grandpa's old work jacket, something he hadn't touched since the funeral. With a quiet breath, he opened the locked notebook for the first time. Inside were pages and pages of writing. Letters of thanks, stories of his youth, memories of the ranch, dreams left undone. Each entry was filled with Henry's voice, witty, wise, raw with honesty. There are notes to Benji, to Rachel, even to Michael. But most of them were addressed simply to my boy. Near the end, Ethan found one final note, dated the week before Grandpa died. "If you're reading this, I was right about you. I knew you'd come through. You didn't just carry my name, you carried the meaning of it. That's all I ever wanted." Ethan closed the notebook, pressing it gently to his chest. Tears welled in his eyes, but he smiled. That weekend, as twilight settled over the valley, Ethan stood on the porch, surrounded by children sitting around the fire. He opened the notebook once more and read aloud. "He gave away money," Ethan said, looking up at the stars, "but left behind something richer." The fire crackled. The kids leaned closer. And somewhere in the quiet hush of dusk, Ethan could almost hear Grandpa's voice one last time, laughing, watching proud. "Fade out,"